This video was brought to you by our podcast, Truss Issues. Liz Truss has been Prime Minister for over a month now, and as our previous videos have made clear, she's not exactly had the most cracking start. In her first working week as Prime Minister, she crashed the pound, was forced into a humiliating U-turn, and oversaw a 33% lead for Labour, the largest lead for any political party since the late 90s. Together, this has led to a number of Tory politicians speaking out against her plans, demonstrating the lack of unity in the party, as well as rumours of some even sending in no confidence letters to the 1922 committee. So, with Truss's premiership beset by mistakes and U-turns, and with the wider party in utter disarray, it seems like a pretty good time to look into who could replace Truss if the Conservative Party do decide to eject her from the top job. Before we get into this, it's worth making a few disclaimers. Firstly, it's not actually that easy to get rid of an incumbent Prime Minister. Obviously, Parliament could demonstrate that they have no confidence in Liz Truss, but given the fact that the Conservatives have a 69-seat working majority, and given that the Tories are so far behind in the polls, it's unlikely we'll see enough of them voting for a general election imposing vote of no confidence in which they'd almost certainly lose their job. The other option is a vote of no confidence in Truss herself. This would have to come internally from the Conservative Party themselves. In order for such a vote to be called, 15% of the parliamentary party, so 54 MPs, would need to submit a letter of no confidence. While this is theoretically possible, it's a very high bar. Tory MPs would likely be reluctant to do so, fearing that the current instability would only be made worse by another change of leader. It should be noted additionally that under the current rules of the 1922 committee, a Prime Minister has a 12-month grace period where they cannot face a vote of no confidence from their party. So the point is that as things stand right now, despite the Tories being frustrated with Truss, it seems that it's unlikely that Truss will be removed as leader. But if she continues to make errors and U-turns, perhaps the likelihood will increase. So let's look into three potential successors to Truss: Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, and an unknown outsider. Let's start with Sunak. You might remember Sunak as the Chancellor throughout the pandemic, as one of the architects of the furlough scheme, or possibly even from his Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Or you may know him as the man who ultimately lost the Conservative Party leadership election to Liz Truss. Maybe you like him and what he stood for in the leadership election and as Chancellor, or maybe you don't. What is clear though is that Tory MPs did like him, in fact much more so than Truss. The leadership election worked by having Conservative MPs slowly whittle down those that entered the race to two final candidates. Rishi Sunak was ahead in all 5 rounds, finishing this process with 137 votes to Truss's 113. In essence, Sunak was actually the favourite of Tory MPs. It was only when it went to the wider membership that Truss pulled ahead. So it seems that Sunak is a trusted pair of hands within the party. Obviously, Tory MPs overturning Truss, who was democratically elected by the party, to install their preferred candidate wouldn't look very, well, democratic. So this would only happen after a significant amount of time, and after it has become much more clear that Truss is incapable of doing the top job. In fact, some Conservative MPs have already discussed the possibility of installing Sunak as a sort of caretaker Prime Minister. According to the Eye, former Conservative ministers are looking at plans to put Sunak into number 10 unopposed following next year's local elections. The plan would use the elevation of Michael Howard to the leadership of the Conservative Party as the plan to be replicated. In essence, following Ian Duncan Smith losing a vote of confidence back in 2003, Michael Howard stood unopposed and became leader of the party. These Sunak-backing Tory MPs are hoping that Truss will be unpopular enough by the middle of next year for something similar to happen. Another potential plan to get Sunak into number 10 was laid out by Andrew Marr on LBC.
If a Prime Minister can't get her business through the House of Commons, and the party can't get rid of the Prime Minister, then that is national paralysis. And at that point, the King has a duty to step in. He's new in the job, but he would have to tell her she needed a mandate, and she would have to listen.
So it's clear that there is support for Sunak, and there are some ways he could make it into number 10. So let's move on and have a look at whether Boris Johnson could make his way back into Downing Street. Well, it seems that Johnson still commands support from the public, and even some in the House of Commons. Polls throughout the leadership election revealed that about half of the Conservative Party members wanted him to make a comeback. Since he left number 10, Nadine Dorries has been seen as Johnson's unofficial spokesperson. In interviews last week, she refused to rule out a return to frontline politics from Johnson, which could be a sign that he would be willing to take over again if Truss's premiership falls apart. To be fair, he hinted as much himself when he announced he'd be leaving Downing Street. At his final Prime Minister's questions, he declared, "Mission accomplished. For now." Perhaps then he'll throw his hat in the ring if the government does fall in the next year. He already has a following amongst a number of backbenchers who may now regret their decision to topple him, particularly because he delivered a majority for the Conservatives for the first time since John Major. Now, we should say that this is an unlikely possibility. It is true that former Prime Ministers have made a comeback. In fact, behind closed doors, it was reported that Johnson wanted to make a comeback akin to that of Winston Churchill. It's worth noting that in post-World War II history, no Prime Minister has ceased to be leader of their political party and then come back as leader. Churchill was out of power and was leader of the opposition and then came back upon winning the election. So, moving on to the final possibility, that some outsider wins a potential leadership race. As we've hopefully made clear, the likelihood of a leadership election imminently is unlikely. But if Truss continues as she is, we could see one in the next year or so. Now, while Sunak or Johnson could enter the race, it's probably more likely that another MP could win and act as some sort of caretaker Prime Minister. It's been suggested that the former Transport Secretary Grant Shapps could take on this role, or possibly even former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. This could only happen if Truss was brought down though, and it's worth reiterating again that this is not particularly likely in the near term. Anyway, these are the possibilities of how Truss could be succeeded and who by. And if you want to keep up with all things Truss, then check out our podcast Truss Issues, where we're evaluating Liz Truss's first 100 days in office and working out if she'll even make it to 100. So subscribe in your favourite podcast app for more political chatter, or you can watch it on the TLDR podcast YouTube channel.